Gigabyte Aorus B550, and we're answering a question today in response to a video. And that's the MSI Meg Godlike X570 with two RTX 3090s and MSI M.2 Expander Aero. And really the crux of that was resource allocation. And the question from that subscriber, and I'm going to modify it a little bit so we can be complete with this. With PCI Express NVMe M.2 on adapter installed in PCI Express slot 2 below the GPU slot on an Aorus B550, will it cut the GPU lanes to 8? Yes, that's a mouthful, but so much so, we've had several comments and I haven't had any feedback yet from that viewer. And I think the best way to do this is to first of all, let's look at this from the chipset standpoint. We're going to look at three motherboards because Gigabyte Aorus B550, there's three motherboards. So of the chipset that we're going to look at first, and of the three motherboards we're going to look at the manuals in all three of those motherboards. We're going to look at three different pages, the three same pages in all those motherboards. Because answering that question, and I'm going to modify a little bit, can I put an M.2 NVMe dual adapter, or can I put a quad adapter by 16 on that motherboard? And we're going to go through that, and I'm going to show you how those resources play out. Now, because of the questions that keep coming up on the motherboards, this is kind of going to be a little bit deeper dive, not real deep, but a little bit deeper than what we've been going, so we can kind of explain how this all lays out, because each one of these three motherboards, it's a little bit different. But the answer may surprise you. Let's see how this plays out. The first thing we need to do is take a look at the AMD B550 chipset. Let's look at the specifications and see what we have to work with. We have 20 PCI Express 4.0 lanes, 20. Keep that in mind. And on this chipset, Gigabyte has three motherboards, Elite, Master, and Pro. We're going to look at those three, 1, 2, 3, and itemize. Let's go to the first one. Okay, the first motherboard, the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Elite. And remember, we're looking for three things. Let's download the manual. We're going to go to page 4. We're looking at the motherboard layout. We identify that we have three slots, three 16-lane slots mechanically. That's the first thing we're looking at. Number 2, let's look at the M.2 connectors. We have an M2A underscore CPU, and we have an M2B underscore SB. Let's go to page 5 and look at the motherboard block diagram. All right, what is connected to the CPU? A 16-lane slot dedicated, and it's PCI Express 4.0. Anything else that is not connected to the CPU has to go through the chipset, and whatever goes from the chipset to the CPU, if you'll notice, that's PCI Express 3.0 by 4 lanes. So there's where our bottleneck starts, and let's look at our M.2 connectors. Okay, the first M.2 connector. This is to the CPU, and that's the M2A underscore CPU. And the second one is through the chipset, and it's going to be right there, M2B underscore SB. And if we look over here, and remember that's PCI Express 3.0, and if we look over here at our other two slots, PCI Express 3.0, we have two PCI Express by 1, and we have one PCI Express by 2. So let's go back and look at page 4 again. So starting with the slots and lane assignments, that first 16-lane slot is 16 lanes electrically. The second and third 16-lane slots mechanically, and for the two M.2 connectors we have, the top one, which is M2A underscore CPU, that's PCI Express 4.0, and the second one, M2B underscore SB, that's through the chipset, which is PCI Express 3.0. So there's a big difference in the speed of those two. Now let's go take a look at page 7. I hope by doing this, it'll help you guys to understand what you're looking for when you're looking at a motherboard and how those resources are laid out. Okay, on page 7, expansion slots. PCI Express by 16, integrated to the CPU. Down here we have one PCI Express by 16, slot number PCIe X2, and that's 2 lanes. And then we have PCI Express by 16 slot, which is PCIe by X1 underscore 2, and that's 1 lane allocated. So let's go back and look at page 4 again. So mechanically we have 3 16-lane slots, first thing we'll notice. And to reiterate, that first 16-lane slot is a dedicated 16-lane slot for your GPU. However, the other two slots that mechanically are 16 lanes, electrically 2-lane and 1-lane slots. So what would you do with those? I'll just say not a lot, because there's not a lot of resources. Remember, you got 20 PCI Express lanes. So you take 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. See how that's allocated? You got one 16-lane slot, and then number 2, you have one M.2 connector also to the CPU. That's your 20 lanes. It is what it is. So this isn't really kind of a deep dive, but it's a little deeper than we've been going, because I want you to understand of the 3 things you need to look at, which now is number 3. Can I put a dual adapter on this motherboard? No. Can I put a quad adapter on this motherboard? No. You don't have the lanes. You don't have the resources. You don't have the PCI Express resources. That's why we talk about the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare. The TRX40 chipset has the resources you guys want to do the things you're trying to do that you can't do on that chipset. So that's the first motherboard. Now all 3 of these motherboards are laid out differently. Let's look at the next one and see how it's laid out. And this is the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master. Specifications, and we want to take a look at expansion slots. So let's go immediately to the manual. And again on page 4, we have 3 16-lane slots. We also have 3 M.2 connectors. And it's curious to note how this is all laid out, because all 3 of these M.2 connectors say they're to the CPU. So that's a lot of resources. Something's got to give. So PCI Express by 16, PCI Express by 4_1, and PCI Express by 4_2. Let's go. Page number 5. Motherboard block diagram layout. Okay, to the CPU, PCI Express by 4. There's a switch, which means you have one dedicated 16-lane slot, or you have an 8-lane slot, and then you have your other 2 M.2 connectors, which is M2B_CPU and M2C_CPU. Those are shared. So there is your 16 lanes. 8, and then 4 and 4 is 8. That's 16. So these 3 resources are that one resource. If you keep your video card in that and do not use either one of these 2 sockets, then you keep this at 16 lanes. And if you'll notice, your M.2A_CPU, that also is dedicated. And anything that's not through the CPU is through the chipset, and to the CPU, to reiterate, is PCI Express 4. Through the chipset is PCI Express 3. And what do we get? We have one PCI Express by 4 slot. Then we have a switch, which means we have one PCI Express by 4 slot, or we have 2 SATA ports. Wow, that's kind of a bummer. So let's go down to page 7 and see how that lays out. And we are looking at expansion slots. Okay, number 1, PCI Express by 16, integrated to the CPU, PCI Express 4. Down here, 2 PCI Express by 16 slots, which is PCI Express by 4_1 and PCI Express by 4_2, integrated to the chipset, and those are PCI Express 3.0. And if you notice, PCI Express by 4_2 slot shares bandwidth on SATA 3 with the number 4 and 5 connectors. Wow, which means PCI Express by 4_2 operates with 2 lanes, 2 PCI Express lanes, so that you have a SATA number 4 and SATA number 5. Let's go back and look at that page 4 again. So number 1, you have 3 16-lane slots mechanically, but all 3 of those 16-lane slots are not dedicated. In other words, that first 16-lane slot is a shared slot. And if you use those other 2 M.2 connectors on the motherboard, that primary 16-lane slot for your GPU becomes an 8-lane slot. And then down here, you have PCI Express by 4_1. That's 4 lanes. Mechanically, that's 16 lanes, but electrically, that's 4 lanes. And then down here, when you get to PCI Express by 4_2, wow, that's a shared resource as well, because it's either a 4-lane slot or it's a 2-lane slot, because you have to have 1 lane for each one of those SATA ports. So it's a precious resource, and you have to decide how you want to divide it. So first question is, how are resources allocated to the 16-lane slots? Number 2, how are PCI Express resources allocated to the M.2 connectors? And then number 3, can I put a dual adapter on here? No. Can I put a quad adapter on here? No. Why? Not enough PCI Express resources to go around, because how many do you have? You got 20 PCI Express resources, and those PCI Express lanes, well, you do the math. Let's look at number 3. And this is the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro. Again, let's go to specifications. We want to scroll down and take a look at expansion slots. Let's download the manual. And the first thing we want to do is we want to go to page 4, and let's look at the motherboard layout. And again, we have 3 16-lane slots, number 1. Number 2, we have 2 M.2 connectors. And by the nomenclature, we know the top one, M.2A underscore CPU, is to the CPU, and M.2B underscore SB is going to be through the chipset. Now the question is, that says that's a 16-lane slot, that says that's a 4-lane slot, and that says that's a 2-lane slot. Okay, let's go to page number 5, and let's look at the motherboard block diagram. What goes to the CPU as PCI Express 4.0? We have one dedicated 16-lane slot. We have one dedicated M.2 connector, which is M2A underscore CPU. Okay, anything else through the chipset is going to be PCI Express 3, 4 lanes. So that's the pipeline. And we have, looky here, PCI Express 3.0. We have 2 PCI Express by 1 slots, or we have 1 PCI Express by 2 and 2 SATA ports. So let's go to page 7 and let's scroll down. 1 PCI Express by 16 slot integrated to the CPU at PCI Express 4.0. 1 PCI Express by 16 slot PCI Express by 4 integrated to the chipset, which is PCI Express 3.0. That's 4 lanes. And it says here the M2B underscore SB connector shares bandwidth with PCI Express by 4 slot. Well, that's nice. The PCI Express by 4 slot will become unavailable when an SSD is installed in the M2B underscore SB connector. So that renders that slot useless. And for the third one, PCI Express by 16, which is PCI Express by 2, integrated to the chipset, PCI Express 3.0, is 2 lanes. And that slot shares bandwidth on SATA ports 4 and 5. PCI Express by 2 slot will become unavailable. And then you had 2 PCI Express by 1 slots. Yeah, let's go back to page 4. So looks can be deceiving because you have 3 16-lane slots mechanically, but well, you kind of get the drift on how that's all allocated. So the question again, we know how the slot and lane assignments are according to the slots mechanically, and we know how the lane assignments are according to the M.2 connectors electrically. We know the resources that are allocated and how that's allocated because of the chipset. And then number 3, the big question. Can I put a dual adapter on that motherboard? No. Can I put a quad adapter on that motherboard? No. But each one of these 3 motherboards has the same answer, but it's for different reasons, but it's all about PCI Express resources. That's why we talk about the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare. I sound like a broken record, but I keep telling you guys, if you want to do some of the things y'all are wanting to do, you've got to go up to a high-end desktop. You've got to go with the TRX40. And I say this one because we get 2 cards that are included with this motherboard. Number 1 is the quad adapter. And this requires 1 16-lane slot, of which we have 2 16-lane slots and we have 2 8-lane slots. The other card we get number 2, and remember this is PCI Express 4.0. All these are dedicated resources. They're not shared. We have 1 Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 card that takes up 4 lanes. So the other 4 lanes in that 8-lane slot, we lose. But because these are dedicated resources, nothing is shared. And we also have 4 M.2 connectors on this motherboard. 2 to the CPU, which are right here. And then we have the other 2 under 1 heatsink that go through the chipset. So I have to share this with you and compare this because as we get the questions, I want to go a little deeper into the chipsets than some of the ones we've done in the past because it's all about the chipset. Just remember, your motherboard is the foundation of your computer, but the chipset is the foundation of your motherboard. So I want to thank you guys for watching. This is BuildOrBuy. My name's Gil Boyd. We look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.